The fate of an entire continent hung in the balance as two titans prepared to clash on a muddy Belgian field. June 18th, 1815 would become the day that reshaped the political landscape of Europe forever. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered most of the known world, faced his greatest challenge yet. The Duke of Wellington commanded a coalition force that represented Europe's last hope against French dominance. What unfolded over the next 10 hours would determine whether Napoleon's empire would rise again or crumble into dust. But to understand why this single battle carried such monumental weight, we must first journey back to the events that led these two military giants to this fateful confrontation. The year 1814 had seen Napoleon's first abdication and exile to the island of Elba. Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the Corsican general's reign of terror had finally ended. The Congress of Vienna worked tirelessly to redraw the map of Europe, restoring monarchies and establishing a new balance of power. Then came the thunderbolt that shook the continent to its core. On March 1st, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with just over 1,000 men. Within 100 days, he had marched triumphantly back into Paris, reclaimed his throne, and begun assembling the largest army France had ever seen. The European powers who thought they had buried the French threat forever suddenly found themselves facing their worst nightmare. The coalition forces scrambled to respond. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and began mobilizing their armies. The Duke of Wellington, fresh from his victories in the Peninsular War, took command of an Anglo-Dutch army in Belgium. Field Marshal Blücher led the Prussian forces nearby. Their plan was simple yet ambitious: prevent Napoleon from defeating them separately by maintaining communication between their armies. Napoleon understood the precarious nature of his position perfectly. He faced enemies on multiple fronts, with Austrian and Russian armies marching toward France from the east. His only chance lay in striking fast and hard against the coalition forces in Belgium before they could unite against him. If he could defeat Wellington and Blücher separately, he might force the coalition to negotiate, rather than continue what would surely become a prolonged and devastating war. The French Emperor crossed into Belgium on June 15th with an army of 120,000 men. His strategy relied on speed and surprise, driving a wedge between the Anglo-Dutch and Prussian forces before they could coordinate their defense. The opening moves of the campaign unfolded with lightning precision as French columns advanced along multiple routes, keeping their enemies guessing about Napoleon's true intentions. Wellington found himself in an extremely difficult position. His army consisted of British veterans, Dutch and Belgian troops of questionable reliability, and German auxiliaries. Many of his most experienced officers and soldiers remained in America, still fighting the War of 1812. The Duke had to work with what he had while trying to maintain contact with Blücher's Prussians, knowing that their survival depended on mutual support. The first major engagement came at Quatre Bras on June 16th, where Wellington's forces barely held their ground against Marshal Ney's attack. Meanwhile, Napoleon himself led the main French army against Blücher at Ligny, inflicting a severe defeat on the Prussians. As night fell on the 16th, it appeared that Napoleon's strategy was working perfectly. He had prevented the coalition armies from uniting and had dealt significant damage to both, but appearances can be deceiving in warfare. While Blücher's army had indeed suffered heavy casualties at Ligny, it had not been destroyed. The old Prussian field marshal, despite being injured when his horse fell on him during the battle, managed to maintain control of his forces. Instead of retreating eastward toward Prussia as Napoleon expected, Blücher made a crucial decision that would alter the course of history. The Prussian commander ordered his army to retreat northward toward Wavre, maintaining the possibility of linking up with Wellington's forces. This decision kept alive the coalition's hopes of presenting a united front against Napoleon. When French scouts reported the Prussian withdrawal, Napoleon fatally underestimated his enemy's resilience and determination. Wellington, meanwhile, had received word of the Prussian defeat at Ligny during the early hours of June 17th. The Duke faced a critical choice: retreat toward Brussels and the Channel ports, effectively abandoning any hope of cooperation with the Prussians, or stand and fight at a position of his choosing. The Iron Duke, as history would remember him, chose to fight. The village of Waterloo, located just south of Brussels, offered Wellington the defensive position he needed. The terrain featured a ridge that would allow his infantry to take cover from French artillery while providing excellent fields of fire against advancing enemy columns. More importantly, the position lay along the most direct route that would allow Blucher's Prussians to rejoin the battle if they could recover from their mauling at Ligny. As dawn broke on June 18, 1815, approximately 70,000 coalition troops faced 68,000 French soldiers across the rain-soaked fields near Waterloo. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Napoleon's empire, but the entire future of European civilization. The morning of June 18th dawned grey and miserable, with heavy rain having turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and standing water. Napoleon had planned to begin his assault at dawn, but the soggy conditions forced him to delay his attack until the ground could support the movement of his heavy artillery. This seemingly minor postponement would prove to have enormous consequences, as every hour that passed gave Blucher's battered Prussians more time to reorganize and march toward the sound of the guns. Wellington used these precious morning hours to position his forces with meticulous care. He placed his most reliable British and King's German Legion troops in the center and right of his line, while positioning the less experienced Dutch and Belgian units where they could be supported by veteran formations. The Duke's defensive genius lay in his use of reverse slope tactics, hiding the majority of his infantry behind the ridge where French artillery could not reach them. The French Emperor, meanwhile, seemed strangely confident as he surveyed the enemy positions through his telescope. At breakfast with his marshals, Napoleon dismissed concerns about Prussian intervention, declaring that Wellington was a poor general and that the coalition forces would be swept from the field before Blucher could arrive. This overconfidence would prove to be one of several critical errors that would cost him dearly as the day progressed. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, Napoleon ordered the first phase of his attack to begin. 80 French cannons opened fire in a thunderous bombardment designed to soften Wellington's positions before the infantry assault. The Grand Battery, as it became known, created a spectacular display of firepower that shook the ground for miles around. However, the elevated position of Wellington's forces and their deployment behind the ridge meant that much of this artillery fire passed harmlessly overhead. The first major infantry assault came against the Chateau of Hougomont, a fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. Napoleon had intended this attack as a diversion to draw Wellington's reserves away from his centre, but the assault quickly took on a life of its own. The garrison, composed mainly of British guards and German troops, defended the stone buildings with fanatical determination. Throughout the entire day, wave after wave of French infantry threw themselves against the chateau's walls, turning what should have been a minor action into a costly battle within the battle. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon launched his main assault against Wellington's centre. 4 divisions of French infantry, totaling nearly 16,000 men, advanced up the muddy slope in massive columns that stretched across the battlefield. The sight of this human avalanche moving forward with drums beating and eagles gleaming struck fear into many of the coalition troops, particularly the inexperienced Dutch and Belgian units. But Wellington had prepared for exactly this type of attack. As the French columns approached the ridge, British artillery tore gaps in their ranks with devastating effect. When the infantry finally crested the hill, they found themselves facing not a broken enemy, but perfectly formed lines of British redcoats who had been lying down behind the ridge. The famous command, "Stand up! Form square! Make ready!" rang out across the battlefield as Wellington's infantry rose like spectres from the earth. The ensuing firefight demonstrated the superiority of linear tactics over column formations in open battle. British volleys, delivered with mechanical precision, shattered the heads of the French columns before they could deploy into fighting formation. Within minutes, the grand assault had dissolved into chaos as French soldiers fled back down the slope, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead and wounded in the mud. The 10 hours that followed would see Napoleon's dreams of renewed glory crumble beneath the weight of Wellington's iron discipline and Blucher's timely arrival. By evening, the emperor who had once bestrode Europe like a colossus found himself fleeing the field in defeat. Waterloo marked not just the end of the 100 Days, but the final chapter of an era that had convulsed the continent for over 2 decades. The muddy fields of Belgium had witnessed the birth of modern Europe, where the balance of power would hold for nearly a century to come.